Hi. This country's ability to forget history amazes me. All of this anti-Mexican labor stuff, hello, employers have been pitting one ethnic group against each other for 400 years in this country. Anything to pay the lowest possible wages. My great-grandfather was the last full-blood African on my mom's side of the family, my mom's dad's side of the family. He was a businessman, built a church in Walsenburg, Colorado, landowner, owned a racetrack there in the 1800s. The Mexicans who lived in what became Walsenburg, Colorado for 4,000 years were being shut out of the mine jobs once the Italians got there. I mean, this the whole divide and conquer and pitting each other against each other is nothing new. And also, that was, at least on the West Coast, that pitting of together was one of the ways that the Italians gained their white status in the West. So it sometimes works for races, they buy into it, definitely. But it still ends up inequities. And we're at that point, nobody's winning with this divide and conquer situation we're in right now. I can name 7+ generations of my family here in the West, Colorado, New Mexico, California, and Texas. I remember hearing from my now 87-year-old mother, from my aunties, my grandmother who was born in 1898. I remember hearing them speak about these very issues back from their day and the days before them. It was going on even back then. I don't think a lot of us realize that the state of California was actually named after an African queen, Queen Calafia. The Pico Rivera family that governed California under Mexican rule was African, Indios, and Spanish. To be a Californian used to mean to be of a certain race, to be a blend of those three races. Check out some of the census documents from the mid-1800s. The year before the U.S. bought California, you can see names listed and the word negrito in the race column. And then the very next year, the year that the U.S. bought or purchased California, those same names and families, their race is now entered as mestizo or mixed in order for them to be able to keep their land. When the U.S. purchased California, they ruled that no one of African descent could own land. So there, they started pitting us against each other there, in trying to get trying to keep land and trying to separate us. We had been getting along fine, just like in Florida. Florida was a black and African and Indian country before the Seminole Wars. They were streets. They had a form of government. Blacks and Indians getting along just fine, building a country. But the Seminole Wars, the South pushed for the Seminole Wars because they were losing too much money. Too many African slaves were running to Florida to freedom to build this new country. So Mexicans against blacks, Mexicans against Indians, Mexicans against Filipinos, Irish against black, Irish against Indian. That's been going on for 400 years. A lot of the Buffalo Soldiers ended up moving to Mexico eventually. That's the area, it was the Mexico and U.S. border that they helped to protect or help keep the status quo. A lot of them ended up moving to Mexico. That's where their families were, but also we were treated better in Mexico than we were in the U.S. Mexico has had a long history of justice and freedom. Mexico hated slavery. That's what remember the Alamo was all about. Mexico would have sold Texas to the U.S., but under the condition that there would never be slavery on that soil. And the U.S. said, no, we buy it, it's going to be a slave state. You can't tell us what to do. And they refused to buy it, and so invaded it. The South had demanded that Texas be a slave state. They were negotiating slave states at the time, If Texas was a slave state, and then the Midwest, Ohio and that area would be a non-slave state. But so the U.S. insisted on owning and invading Mexico for slavery. That's what the Mexican-American War in 1846 through 48 was all about. Also, I don't think many of us African Americans realize that Cinco de Mayo is also a very important date for us. The French, after the Mexican-American War, the French, Spanish, and English decided to invade Mexico. Mexico had just been through their own civil war and a war with America, so they were hard pressed for finances. The president at that time, President Benito Juarez, decreed that we've got to take 2 years off for, as far as our national debt, as far as paying back any foreign debt payments. Just for 2 years they're going to be suspended, and then after 2 years we'll get back on payments. Paying that would be resumed. The English, Spanish, and French refused to allow that to happen, so they came in and invaded Mexico in order to get those payments by any means necessary. Eventually Mexico kicked out the Spanish and the English. They eventually withdrew. But the French refused to leave. Napoleon Bonaparte III wanted to stay because he was afraid that under U.S. rule, if the French didn't get into Mexico, then the U.S., with the Monroe Doctrine of America for the Americans, would take over Mexico, manifest destiny and all that. So this is according to the UCLA History Department. So Bonaparte fought and fought and fought, and eventually, yes, Mexico beat Napoleon's butt. Also, not only Mexico, but at the same time, the revolutionary leader Toussaint Louverture, I think is how it's pronounced, in Haiti had beat his butt. So that's great. Napoleon got beat on 2 fronts and had to take his broke ass home, which meant he could not invest in the South. Lincoln at that time was siding with Mexico, but we were in our Civil War at the same time, so he could not send any support as far as troops or money. Napoleon was going to back the South once he won. So who knows, without Cinco de Mayo, without that war that the Mexican people won fighting for freedom against Napoleon Bonaparte, we might have a state of apartheid right now. Who knows, if the South had gotten all that money, there's no telling what America would be like right now. With the French backing, financial backing,